All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. I have 6:08, and I'm calling to order the meetings of committees of City Council for Monday, August 1st, 2022. Quickly, here at the top of the meeting, just some brief reminders for everyone. The meeting is being live streamed, so you are on camera. It's for our city YouTube page. To the extent at which there's public comment this evening, please make sure that you're speaking at a microphone. The podium is right there, that you begin your comment with your name for the record and also your block of residence. Lastly, this is a good reminder to silence any devices, including myself. And lastly, as we were a little late here, I must inform you that the council held an executive session with the city solicitor this evening to discuss litigation. And with that, we will do the roll call of members. Mr. Harris.
Yes, Madam Vice President. Mr. Arroyo.
Here.
Ms. Baker.
Here.
Mr. Calise.
Here.
Ms. Craig.
Here.
Ms. Diaz.
Here.
Ms. Walsh.
Here.
And President Smith-Waddell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. We move then into the approval of the minutes of the July 5th committee meetings. I'll hear a motion.
Motion to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Are there any council comments on the minutes? Hearing none, Mr. Harris.
Mr. Arroyo.
Aye.
Ms. Baker.
Aye.
Mr. Calise.
Aye.
Ms. Craig.
Aye.
Ms. Diaz.
Aye.
And Ms. Walsh.
Aye.
Thank you. We begin with the Community Planning Committee. Councilor Craig.
Thank you, Council Vice President. We have three things on the agenda this evening. First of that being Administration Resolution 63, authorizing a cooperation agreement with the Lancaster Public Library for a grant funding. Is there someone here from the library that would please step forward? Good evening, ladies.
Hi, how are you?
Very well.
Melissa Holland, Executive Director, and Jamie Hall, Director of Development. So we are here tonight because we are in the middle of our construction project to move to Yule Plaza. Not on. Here we go. Thank you.
Better, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're here tonight because we are in the middle of our construction project to move Lancaster Public Library to Queen Street on Yule Plaza. And with that construction project, we have a number of grants that we've received, including the RACP grant. One of the requirements of this grant is that we have this cooperation agreement. And so tonight we're asking for your continued support. You have been such a great partner through this project, and we ask that you continue to support us with this grant and this cooperation agreement.
Are there any questions from the committee?
Yes, please. Thank you. And good evening. I would like to know how long will it take to complete the construction of the library?
Sure. We're anticipating that we will open in the spring of 2023, hopefully March of 2023. And construction has been going smoothly, but with everything that has gone on the past 2 years, we're keeping our fingers crossed that it's still smooth sailing all the way to completion.
And after the completion of the construction, will the library offer any service, any new services to the community?
Yes, we will be extending our hours when we move into the new building. Also, with that, we are going to have increased accessibility, just the building itself, but we will also include two-way lockers, so that will, even beyond our hours, people will be able to collect materials. So it's very much like an Amazon locker. You would go on, request your materials, our librarians would fill them, and then you'd use your library card to access those materials after hours. The new space will also allow for much larger spaces and flexible spaces, so we can increase our programming and offer bigger programs and community spaces for Lancaster.
We'll also have study rooms for both adults and for our young adults. We will have a dedicated space for the first time in a glassed-in area where tweens and teens will be able to work and study and gather together. But we will have a lot of variety of rooms that different organizations can rent from us, with kitchenettes also, which is a very big plus that we understand is needed in the city.
Okay. And who will be in charge of the construction?
We have Benchmark Construction as our construction company. We've also worked with Hamel Architects to design the library.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor.
Are there any further questions from the committee? Any questions from the public? Right on time.
Tim Stuhldreher, One United Lancaster. Two questions. First of all, I think the last time Lisa and I talked, the budget was 10 million. Wanted to see if that's still the case. And second, just confirming that the city is essentially functioning as a pass-through.
Yes and yes. The budget is
That
still
was easy.
10 million, and we're, yes, working as part of the grant for the RACB is that we work with our municipality, which of course is the city.
And of that $10 million, we're around the $8 million mark right now. So we still have ways to go, but we've made a lot of progress to this point.
Great. Are there any further questions from the public? Okay, hearing none, I'll hear a motion to move this to full council on the 9th. Is it the 9th? The 9th.
Motion. Sorry. Motion to move to full council on August 9th.
Second.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank
Thank
you.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is Administration Bill Number 16, amending the Central Market Trust Ordinance. And I'm not sure.
We have this evening Melissa and Bruce.
Put my glasses on, sorry.
Melissa Seawick is the Executive Director of Central Market Trust, and Bruce Martin is the Board President.
Fantastic. Good evening.
Good evening, Councilor Craig and committee members. We've been in conversation with the mayor's office as we embark on developing implementation strategies for the strategic plan that you have heard from us in the past, last fall and in the year before that. Now that we have advanced beyond the pandemic, we're trying to kick all of those things out. One of those things being, of course, the hiring of an executive director to help us execute all of those things. The conversations that we've had with Mayor Sirachi's office was making sure that as we grow as an organization, that the city council ordinance, which first created the trust back in 2005, align with what we're doing and fit with the way that the organization itself wants to grow. So two specific changes relate to board membership, how many members can serve on the board, and whether or not elected officials are permitted to serve on the board are the two specific items in that particular section. And then the other section are operationally, operation around holidays, hours of operation. And that become particularly important for us as we look at potentially doing other types of outreach to target specific communities that maybe are not benefiting from the current hours of operation of the central market. How to meet those needs without necessarily changing the operations of the Central Market House itself.
Mhm.
So we wanted to make sure that there were no conflicts between ordinance and the plans that we're hoping that we can develop in the next 12 to 18 months to to expand our scope and reach to broaden our impact within the community.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Questions from the public?
Just wondering if you could be a little more specific about the plans to broaden the impact.
The strategic plan calls for widening our outreach into the community, so that would include, and these are all just strategic ideas at this point. As we develop our plan, we'll be looking at delivery, online ordering, and pop-up markets in areas that are considered food deserts within the Lancaster County area and the city.
Very good. Are there any further questions from the public? No, since, do we need to do anything different because this is a bill? Okay, great. Right. So I'll hear a motion to move this to full council on the 9th for first reading.
Motion to move to full council on August 9th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great, thank you. Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last item on our agenda this evening is amending the sewer control plan to include a word that I can't say. That's it. Defense Rural Business Park. Good evening, Douglas.
Hi, good evening, Councilor Craig and committee. This is a sewer control amendment of the sewer control plan, as Councilor stated, for Fatonis Defense. This is located at the Rural Business Park. It's a business that has operated there for some years, and they're a U.S. defense contractor. It is a small industrial facility, and according to the website, they provide premier and advanced products in the fields of broad bandwidth, high-power microwave amplifiers, cutting-edge night and digital vision technologies. This is a bit of an unusual request because typically this is related to a land development of some kind that I'm able to point to. In this case, there is no land development. There's no land development plan that's proposed here. This is an industrial facility that had been carting away industrial water that they were disposing of through frac tanks and an off-site facility. And they are seeking permission to discharge this wastewater into the city's system. So the decision that's before you tonight is just an action on the volume of that. Just to give you a sense of the volume that's being proposed for discharge, it's on the order of about 20 houses, for instance, the water that would be generated from those 20 homes. It is my understanding that there still are additional approvals that would have to be achieved in order for this to happen. Certainly a utility connection into our system, the stormwater permissions to actually disturb the earth and lay that line. And then ultimately there would need to be a wastewater discharge approval from the city and a site inspection that would also evaluate what is in the water that's being discharged into our system. The plan that was submitted says that this is condensate and scrubber blowdown, which essentially is a fancy way of saying as a boiler is boiling water and creating steam for power. There are impurities that concentrate both in the boiler and in the scrubber, the chimney tube, basically. So this is water that's being expelled to remove those impurities from water that they're getting from our own wastewater, or our own water system. So anyway, that's probably too much information, but I just want to provide a little bit of background into what you're voting on this evening. Happy to answer any questions, but this is being recommended for approval, and our water and wastewater engineers have reviewed this and completed all of the necessary paperwork.
So, thank you. I can't say that it doesn't sound concerning, because it does.
Sure.
So, what have been the findings of the effect that it's going to have on our water?
So that will be determined through the wastewater discharge approval that they have to achieve from the city. I did call our lead engineer, Christine Volke-Hilditch, who oversees our wastewater plant operations, and she did tell me that there would be an extensive review before this would be permitted to proceed. And that includes, naming all of the different contents of that water, if there are any, that's, beyond just the water. So the volume typically, I should say, I also confirmed that there's no requirement for them to offset that volume, and I think we've discussed this in the past. When a new building creates stormwater, they have to manage that stormwater. When there's an increase in sewage, there's not a requirement to offset that additional sewage discharge. As at the moment, it appears that everything is in order, and the approval of this, again, is just for the volume of the sewer, which this actually used to be connected to our system in the past. And for whatever reason, it then it was disconnected from our system, removed from frac tanks, off to another site, and now they're asking to reconnect. That is all the information that I have. I don't know the history of how this all happened and why it was originally disconnected. But certainly there will be transparency through the wastewater discharge permitting process.
So, it has to go to someone else before it's official anyway.
Yes.
But after it goes before, then will it come back to us for approval?
It would not need to at that point. The rest of it would be administrative. So from here, the DEP still needs, the Department of Environmental Protection for the state still needs to review the permit and make sure that they have your resolution, that we've stated it's in conformance with our land use plans, because it's an existing facility and previously was allocated sewer capacity by the city. We're saying, yes, it is in conformance with our land use plans. After DEP reviews, they would submit for a wastewater discharge permit with our wastewater bureau, and that would be reviewed. I'm not very familiar with that process. I don't know whether that then goes to the DEP as well, but certainly we would be reviewing that with our engineers. And then for construction, they would have to secure stormwater permits for the on-site construction.
Okay, and I think the last question that I have is, Mr. Campbell, do you know anything about this? I need more input.
Thank you for inviting me up. I know very little more than what Douglas has already described. However, what I can say is we have confirmed that we have the capacity to take this on in terms of the volume of water to be brought into the system. But the DEP review, the technical review, will be determining the quality of the water that is brought forward. And there may be additional requirements to ensure that it is clean. We, as the city of Lancaster, we've always prided ourselves that we put cleaner water into the river than we take out. And this organization will still need to meet those same kind of standards for their ability to get an approval from our wastewater division as well. So I feel comfortable that for what is being asked for at this moment, which is, do we have the capacity to deal with the volume? The answer is absolutely yes. As Douglas had said, about 20, even if it was 25 or 30 units worth of residential units worth of water, we have more than the capacity to accommodate that. It's the type and the quality of the water that will be coming forward, and that is the next series of approval processes. If it does not pass through that, it will not be given an approval. But I think, if I understand correctly, they need the approval that the volume that's being requested is something that in principle can be accommodated, and I'm assuring you that that is the case.
As long as you're going to keeping an eye on it. Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Council?
Just one question. What is the timeline on that secondary review of the water that will be coming from the facility?
So this portion of the review can take roughly 3 months to get through DEP for approvals. The wastewater discharge permit, to be honest, I don't have experience with that process, and I don't know if Director Campbell could help with that.
I will say I don't know either. In fact, the 3 months for DEP is what we generally schedule, but it often takes significantly longer to get through DEP. If the engineers are not able to fulfill our initial requirements, that's the first threshold. It may take however long it takes for them to assure us that this is what they're doing, these are the operations, these are the chemicals that they're planning to use, et cetera, et cetera. And if those meet all of our standards, then it gets applied to DEP, and that will initiate their usually 90-day review process. But I will tell you from our experience, it takes anywhere from 90 to 180 days, more or less, depending on volume, depending on a variety of other kinds of things. But it has to get through us first, then it'll go to DEP. And it may have to go through a cycle again, but that is relatively rare.
And are they operating currently?
But not connected. I mean, this is the request to connect to our system.
Sure, but conceivably, they may have gone through this process before in whatever municipality that they are connected to currently?
I honestly, I don't know enough of the detail of this particular site.
Sure.
So currently, I mean, they are within Lancaster City. They're not connected to any other municipal utility system other than ours. While they were previously connected to our system, for whatever reason, they disconnected and started hauling all of their processed water off-site. Now they're looking to reconnect to the city facility. And I don't know where that water went. Someone who was accredited to dispose of it, and why that was the case, I think we will perhaps find out through the wastewater discharge permit when we understand the contents of the water.
Is it possible that we find out why they disconnected their connection, their previous connection?
Certainly, it's a worthwhile question, and I've been in contact with Ritu, who's the engineering company that's assisting them with this. It was not mentioned in their letter as to why that disconnection initially occurred, but I think it's a worthwhile question, and certainly I will forward that on to the engineers, and I think, again, that'll be helpful background information as Public Works considers wastewater discharge permit.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lost my place. I think we were asking for questions from the public.
Keith Holland, 315 West Mifflin Street. Question I have is, are we going to have a third-party review, and how long or a timetable of reviewing this?
Thank you, Mr. Holland. So I can answer initially for this action, the sewer control plan. We generally don't have a third party review the discharge amounts that we're approving. We have our utility wastewater engineer, Mr. Brian Harner, and we have our water engineer, Brian Perwin, who reviews any water allocation that would also be required. And then there's city planning staff that reviews it from a land use point of view and make sure it's in conformance with our land use goals. And then the county also does their own review for consistency with the county comprehensive plan. All of that is packaged and sent to DEP for review. The wastewater discharge permit, it's my understanding we review most of those in-house. If there is a need for a third party, I think Public Works would be making that decision.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from the public? Okay, seeing none, I'll hear a motion to move this to full council on the 9th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Council Vice President. That concludes community planning.
Thank you very much. That will take us to the agenda of the public.
Madam Vice President.
Sorry.
Go right ahead.
Councilor Diaz had made the motion, but she's not on the Community Planning Committee. So if we can circle back, I'm happy to make the motion to move the resolution to full council on August 9th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping us within parliamentary procedure over there, Mr. Harris. Okay, so now that takes us to the Public Works Committee. Councilor Walsh.
Thank you, Council Vice President. We have 5 items on the agenda, the first being Administrative Resolution Number 64, 2022, which is the request and extension of the Christian Street Bicycle Boulevard Grant. The second, Administrative Resolution Number 66, 2022, authorizing a grant application for Vision Zero Plan implementation. Number 3, Administration Resolution 67, 2022, authorizing a grant application for the eastbound connector pathway. Number 4, Administration Bill Number 15, 2022, establishing rules for flying flags at city facilities. And last but certainly not least, Administration Bill Number 17, 2022, amending the Stormwater Management Ordinance. So let's start at the top with Administration Resolution Number 64, 2022 with the Christian Street Bicycle Boulevard Grant. There we go.
Quite a mouthful. Thank you very, very much for hearing the Public Works this evening. This first resolution, 64, 2022, is a resolution extending the deadline of an automated red light enforcement, or ARLE, grant in the amount of $458,080 from the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation to be used for the intersection improvements along Christian Street. This is in large part the active transportation, extension of the active transportation plan, the bike route that currently goes, or currently is laying out from Harrisburg Pike all the way to King Street. This portion is the portion from Chestnut to King, and for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being COVID, the design work was extended and we needed more input from the adjacent property owners. And so the amount of money that we've already been granted remains the same. We're just asking for an extension so that the work, which was scheduled to be completed by November 15th of this year, will be able to be performed and be completed by November 15th of 2023. Of next year. The provisions of PennDOT access to funds provide for us to be able to ask for such an extension, and that is what we are hereby doing in order to make use of the funds we already have and make this active transportation stretch work.
So just so I'm hearing you correctly, the scope isn't changing. There's really nothing changing at all other than the due date or the deadline for when you need to expend these funds or have the project be complete.
That is exactly correct.
Great, thank you. Any questions from other committee members? Council as a whole? Public? All right, so I will make a motion to move Administration Resolution Number 64, 2022 to full council on August 9th.
Second.
Moving right along to Administration Resolution Number 66, 2022, authorizing a grant application for Vision Zero Plan implementation. Sorry to move so quickly. So we had the motion and the second, and all in favor.
Aye.
There we go. All right, we'll get it right on the next one. Director Campbell, can you talk us through the grant application for Vision Zero, the plan implementation?
Yes, as you know, we're wanting to implement the Vision Zero plan for the city of Lancaster. Vision Zero being the plan to eliminate deaths and severe injuries throughout the city by the year 2030. That's for us, a very aggressive timeframe, but we believe that it is doable based on the work that has been done so far. The Federal Department of Transportation has made money available, and the maximum amount that we can apply for is $10 million. We, the city of Lancaster, would be required to make a 20% match or a $2 million match. We have already frankly budgeted for over the next few years in our capital plan to be able to spend $2 million per year to execute Vision Zero. This would allow us to not have to spend so much of our own money to do so. And that's what we are hoping to do here. So what we're basically asking for is the permission in an administrative sense to apply for this $10 million, which would be spent over the course of the next 4 to 5 years to execute Vision Zero, and which is also a further implementation of the Safe Streets for All grant, program, which was put in place by Mayor Sarachi at the beginning of her first administration, for her first term. I think that's about all that I'm looking for here.
So you will be applying for the whole 10 million. If you are not granted that full 10, do you have other resources or applications in place to?
We have
Fill that
actually
gap.
budgeted to be able to spend $2 million per year. If we get, however much money we get through this grant, means we do not have to use city money to do that, except for the 20% match. So our plan is to be able to be spending $2 million per year over the next 5 years, one way or the other. Our goal would be to have as much of that granted to us so that we can go about doing other things. We're trying to build as pedestrian-friendly a street system as we can. We're furthering the active transportation plan. As many of you know, the Parks Master Plan effort has commenced, so we will have an extensive parks system that we want to supplement, and we prefer to not have to spend our dollars on transportation needs if that can be made available from the feds.
Any idea on award time, if you were to be awarded this 10 million? Any idea of the life cycle of the due date or when we can expect an award notification?
So I have Tina Campbell, who is our grants manager, who may be able to speak more to the timeframe.
Great, thank you.
Evening. So the timeframe isn't exactly clear, but we know it's going to be sometime at the beginning of the year. And then from there, we have 5 years to use the funding from the grant. So we would apply for that up to 10 million to be used over the next 5 years.
So it's a rolling application, or does it have a firm deadline?
It does have a firm deadline. It's due September 15th.
Great.
Yeah.
Good luck. Any questions from other committee members? Council as a whole? Public?
Tim Stuhlter, One United Lancaster. Some grants are highly competitive, others are more like, as long as you fill it out, you tend to get the money. Where does this fall on that continuum?
I'm going to defer to Tina to try to answer that question as well.
So yes, this is a competitive grant. This is, I would say it's pretty highly competitive. This is the first of the new grants that have come out that we're applying for through the bipartisan infrastructure law that came out in November. The advantage that we have is that you have to have a adopted safety action plan, which is our Vision Zero plan, and many cities do not have them actually adopted yet. They're working on them, but it's surprising that many aren't adopted. So that's an advantage that we have.
And I'd like to add to that as well. We are a Vision Zero city. There aren't as many of those throughout the United States as one might like to think, as important as the Vision Zero initiative is nationally and internationally. So I think to the extent that we are proactively addressing reduction and elimination of deadly and serious accidents, we are in a better position to be looked at favorably for this kind of grant, which is specifically under the Safe Streets subsection of Department of Transportation's.
Any other questions from the public?
I
just have a question about the implementation of the grant. You know, we're doing a comprehensive plan, so you're planning now 10 years out. With all the meetings that are going on, and I know at one of our sessions, we talked about areas that were not safe. Is there room to implement what you're finding out now from residents as far as where those areas are? Or are you going off of the vision plan that's already been adopted, because this may not happen in 2030, and, you know, we're looking at that now. So I just want to know if there's room for change.
Well, the simple answer is that there's always room for change, but the perhaps more important answer is that a lot of work has gone on in trying to prioritize the Vision Zero needs over the course of the last 3 to 4 years. We have identified a high injury network where we have 10 high injury intersections, and we have 10 stretches of high injury streets that are distributed throughout the city. One can actually find a map of those, of the data for that on the Engage Lancaster website. So what we're engaged in right now is the prioritization of those particular elements. Most of our high injury network and most of the deadly accidents take place on our state roads, which are the key arteries that go north, south, and east, west through the core of the city. And part of our challenge is how do we address at the state Department of Transportation level the needs of addressing Vision Zero, but secondly, how do we mitigate the intersection of our local roads and the state roads to make that difference? Because the goal is to eliminate or reduce or eliminate those deadly accidents by 2030, we actually need to be able to implement this work within the next 4 to 6 years so that we have 1 or 2 years remaining to be able to actually not only measure its effectiveness, but to make the kinds of tweaks that would make the difference where we may be falling short. So a huge amount of the work has already taken place with outreach to a variety of communities. The website at Engage Lancaster is still open, and we are constantly in discussion with the steering committee on prioritization, what should be done first, second, what is the low-hanging fruit that we can be doing that can make the greatest difference, et cetera. And we're always open to hearing more input that may affect all of those kinds of concerns. And I do want to say there are high injury network and street lines as well as intersections in all 4 of the quadrants. But I believe there are none in the extensions. I think there might be one up northwest in Harrisburg Pike, but almost all the rest are in the 4 quadrants.
Any other questions from the public? So I will make a motion to move the administrative resolution number 6622 to full council on August 9th.
So moved. So moved.
Oh, second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Great. Moving right along, Administration Resolution 67, 2022, authorizing a grant application for the eastbound connector pathway.
Thank you again. This is another one of the administrative requests to be given permission to make a grant application for $1.121850 million for the multimodal transportation, which is an extension of the eastbound connector. Now, the eastbound connector, as many of you may be aware, is part of our active transportation plan, which links to the countywide active transportation plan as well. When we say active transportation plan, for the most part, that means the bike infrastructure, the bicycle infrastructure. The westbound connector on Walnut Street has already been performed. The eastbound connector has been designed and will be implemented next spring. This grant will be for the design and the implementation of the westernmost end of the east and westbound connector so that it can connect to the Greater Lancaster Heritage Pathway, which is the county-wide part of the network, as well as some improvements all the way over in the east to Broad Street. We will be stopping just short of where we have to intersect with several other municipalities, because that's going to be a different kind of a challenge for all of us. But this funding would allow us to make the strong connections from the local active transportation network to the county-wide active transportation network, as planned and consistent with not only the county plan, but our own complete streets and safe streets planning effort.
And like the other grant application, do you have any sense of timeline for awards?
This is around the same time as the other grant application. They expect probably the November, it's the Commonwealth Financing Authority that does this grant, and they expect to vote on it in the November board meeting.
And the amount of match that's required from the city?
There actually isn't a match required for this grant because we're a municipality. So we
Great.
didn't add one in.
We love that.
Yes, yes, we do. Any other questions from the committee? Council as a whole? Public?
Two things. First, would the grant cover the entire project cost? And second, is there a public map available of the eastbound connector?
To answer the first question, yes, it would cover the construction, all of the construction required to implement the connectivity of the westbound and eastbound connector to the Greater Lancaster Heritage Pathway. Some of those public meetings have already been taking place in the area around Race Street, College Avenue, State Street, et cetera, because this is where the connections are proposed from the Greater Lancaster Heritage Pathway. The second question, I apologize. So on Engage Lancaster, there are active maps of the eastbound connector as it is proposed and has been redesigned. There have been some redesign elements based on public meetings that took place over the last 8 to 10 months or so. Also on the county map, the County of Lancaster map, there is an active transportation website that talks about the larger county-wide network to which our active transportation network will be connected.
Any other questions from the public?
Keith Holland again. I understand that we're doing it eastbound and for the bikes and all those particulars. I think about the cars and transportation that we have in the city, since we have such an old city. More cars because of more families, more kids and everything else. You got 4 or 5 cars to a household. You're taking away the space of vehicles. So what are we doing for our future of transportation that's around the city if this is all part of it?
Thank you for that question. It's an open-ended question, and there's a lot of answers to it, but I'm going to try to be brief because we're focusing on it in a very particular way. The nature of active transportation is that it provides additional opportunities for people who often are not able to afford to own or maintain a car and still be able to get to work and recreate, etc. So it's not only providing alternatives that are more affordable for most of the population of the city of Lancaster, but it allows them to be more active and therefore hopefully more physically fit while they're doing that. The eastbound and westbound connectors, which are the strongest and the most involved of the infrastructure, are only on 2 key streets, Walnut Street and Lemon Street. We have gone to great lengths to minimize the number of parking spaces that get eliminated by being able to make that transportation network work. And as such, hopefully make it a much more successful infrastructure. The nature of bicycle infrastructure is, and I know people don't like to hear this, if you build it, people will actually start to use more of it. The purpose of the eastbound and westbound connector, by being as strong of infrastructure as it is to make people who are not yet comfortable riding their bikes in the public right-of-way more comfortable, because these are separated bike lanes that allow people to get from east and west and feel more comfortable while they're doing so. Simultaneously, though, we, at the Traffic Commission level, at the Department of Public Works level, and at the parking resolutions level, are looking at the challenges of parking writ large. The challenges of the RPP, the residential parking permitted areas, which often are creating a false scarcity because they're taking parking spaces away that could be made available to more people. We're looking at the exact dynamic that you had mentioned, which is demographically over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, more families have been acquiring more cars per family. And often this is not only exacerbated and doubled by the fact that you've got teenagers who get a car in order to go to work. Hopefully this can be alleviated in some part by having some of the bicycle infrastructure. But as townhouses get divided into multiple units, each of those units often have one or two, possibly even three cars associated with them. And guess what? We're not building more streets. The streets are not getting bigger. The demand on the existing street infrastructure is getting more severe. We actually have reached out to South End concerned neighbors, and they actually had spent several months working on alternatives for their community, which in fact can be applied throughout the city. We tremendously welcomed and had I'm hoping you felt it was a very useful, happy-making, and trying discussion. There were a lot of challenges that we need to be able to talk about. We're going to be doing some of the same thing with several other communities as well, but we're wanting to look at the nature and the issue of parking writ large. We're also partnering with Lancaster Parking Authority, because even though their parking structures focus on the needs of the downtown and the businesses, they in fact can be part of that solution. And some of what we came up with some of the community outreach was, how do we work with not-for-profit organizations that may have parking lots available that they're not necessarily using all 5 days or 7 days of the week, that might be made available in different ways. There are no final answers yet, but we, in a much more concerted effort, are addressing the larger issue, and hopefully will be coming forward to the public for, believe it or not, it's going to be probably a 2 to 3 year process of trying to address the needs of parking throughout the entirety of the city of Lancaster. I think I very much appreciate your question. It's a tremendously pressing question, and everything that we do in terms of public works, whether it's cleaning the streets, green infrastructure, bike infrastructure, often tags into that parking. We've also made sure to seat parking as a high priority in the comprehensive plan effort, so that the dialogue is going on in a multifaceted way, not just within 6 heads that might be related to DPW.
Thank you both for the conversation, because I think it's really important to keep a lot of these pieces in context, because we can look at them as silos, but at the end of the day, it all is connected. So thank you for the question and the response. Any other questions from the public? So I will make a motion to move Resolution 67, 2022 to full council on August 9th.
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Next, we'll move to Administration Bill 15, 2022, which is establishing rules for flying flags at city facilities.
Good evening. It's not often the solicitor shows up with an ordinance, but this one is prompted by some recent case law. So just outside the entrance to Lancaster City Hall stand 3 flagpoles. City typically flies the United States flag from one, the Commonwealth flag from another, and the City of Lancaster flag from the third. And oftentimes throughout the course of a year, we'll fly commemorative flags and or sister city flags or national origin flags. The City of Boston had an identical situation with identical practices that the city follows. Those practices were challenged in 2017. Harold Shurtleff, the director of an organization called Camp Constitution, asked to hold an event on Boston's Plaza to celebrate the civic and social contributions of the Christian community, and as part of the ceremony, he wished to raise what he described as the Christian flag. The commissioner of Boston's property management department worried that flying a religious flag would violate the separation of church and state requirements under the United States Constitution. He denied the permit request. It was appealed to the Supreme Court. Just this past May, the Supreme Court found that because the flag-raising program of Boston did not express government speech, in other words, speech of the government itself, Boston's refusal to let petitioners fly their flag violated the free speech clause of the First Amendment, stating that when the government does not speak for itself, it may not exclude private speech based on religious viewpoint. Doing so constitutes impermissible viewpoint discrimination. Now we come back to the City of Lancaster. In order to continue to recognize the importance, civic pride, and reverence that come with the display of the nation's flag, the Commonwealth's flag, and the city's flag, and that any other flags, such as ceremonial, commemorative, or organization flags, will be deemed by many as the city's support for the sentiments expressed by the flag, and that's essentially what the Supreme Court found, is that the flag itself is speech. It carries a message. So the issue that was really before the Supreme Court was that the flagpoles were essentially places of public accommodation. City council chambers, our streets, places where events can be held and the city can't regulate the speech. The exception under the United States Constitution is that the city can regulate its spaces if it is doing so by not making it a public accommodation. So in other words, if anybody can submit an application for a flag and it goes up on a first-come, first-served basis, then that is a public accommodation, which means that you can't exclude a flag. So there may be viewpoints that a flag expresses that you members of council may not wish to be represented on that flagpole. I'm sure all of you can think of a few as you sit here. That being said, that's the double-edged sword of, well, we want to support this particular organization, but we really don't want to say the government supports that one. So how do we accomplish that goal? What you have before you is an ordinance tonight that declares first and foremost that the city flagpoles are not places of public accommodation. They are facilitators of government speech. In other words, only flags that city council, as the legislative body of the city, approves will be placed on that flagpole. Now, yes, this is going to create a new procedure for you. I get that. But what it's also going to do is create clarity in terms of a process, and that it is only the viewpoints of the city of Lancaster that are expressed on that flagpole. No flag will be flied at the discretion of any one member of City Hall, whether that be in the administration, or one member of City Council. It will be government speech. So, we can think of flags that we've flown in the past, just recent ones, and City Council would be able to continue to approve those. But they would have to be City Council approving it. They wouldn't be flown because the administration or somebody in the mayor's office took the lead and said, okay, yes, we've got our flag, we can put it up, and here's the event. So, in order to accomplish what the Supreme Court has said we have to accomplish in order to be able to control what goes on the flagpoles, we have before you this evening an ordinance that allows for a process. The process would be as follows. 120 days, at least 120 days prior to any organization or any cause wanting to fly a flag, it would need to submit an application which will be prepared by the Department of Neighborhood Engagement. and be readily available on the website, and hopefully form fillable on the site as well, as we move to that for everything. That application would then be brought before City Council at a committee meeting. Now, council may have to direct which committee or establish it as a standing part of the committee of whole practice. The entity or agency or individual who wishes to have that flag flown would obviously have the opportunity to now come and talk to you and explain why it's important for this flag to be flown. And then City Council would be asked to adopt a resolution and or proclamation that says, yes, this is the flag, this is the intent of the flag, this is the message we want to be sent by flying the flag, and you're approved to fly the flag for a period not to exceed 3 business days. It only goes up on one of the poles. It still has to comply with the United States flag policies in terms of how it's flown in proportion to where it's flown. So believe it or not, there's a whole series of federal regulations and state regulations in most states about how we can actually fly the flag, the size of the flag. So this ordinance basically requires that the flag comply with those. In long and short, it can't be bigger than the U.S. flag, and it can't be flown above it. Once the policy is that, once the proclamation or resolution is then approved at a city council meeting, then it would move to the Office of Neighborhood Engagement to work with that individual or entity for their event, whether they want to hold a flag raising ceremony. If so, the ordinance provides that the administration has the right to have a representative speak at the flag raising ceremony. Again, this is government speech, right? This is your message, the City of Lancaster government's message. So even if a private entity is hosting the event and holding the event, the city needs to have the right to be there and speak to assure that the speech is consistent. Again, the message is this is the government speech that the flag is going on. We're not editing what they say. It's a right to be there. This will also require the city administration and city council to be a little proactive in advance so that we can plan almost a year in advance. These are the events we know are coming. So I anticipate that city council, if this ordinance is adopted, would show up probably in January of every year at a committee meeting with either one long resolution or a series of resolutions for events and flags that it wishes to have approved by city council for raising throughout the year with the dates so that they can get on a schedule. The ordinance also provides the flag must be provided by the entity or organization a week, essentially prior to the event, 5 days. Then it must be picked up at least 2 days, no later than 2 days after. The city is not buying flags. If an individual or entity wishes to have the flag flown, then it needs to provide that flag. And it needs to be in an appropriate manner. It can't be torn, can't have holes in it, can't be ripped. Has to have, the appropriate holes and grommets to be able to be hoisted on the city flagpoles. And believe it or not, a lot of that is consistent, again, with U.S. policy that flags are not supposed to be torn and tattered and kept in good wear and tear. So that's what's before you this evening, is an ordinance to accomplish this. You would think that I would have better things to do all day than to draft ordinances about flags, but it is a very important part of our community. If you walk by City Hall today, now that it's been completed, one of the first things that you see as you walk in that block of South Duke Street are the 3 flags flying very high at the top of City Hall off of those 3 poles. And so everybody wants to see that flag flown, and those who don't, that's up to them, but council wants to see those flags flown. And then the commemorative flags, the national origin flags that you want flown that provide the government message, now there's a procedure for making sure they're flown in an organized manner, timely manner, with a process for getting them approved by council. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but one, can you just, what is in existence now? Let's say an organization comes to the city and says, I want to fly my flag. What are we essentially changing from what it is now to what this?
There is no written policy currently. It has been essentially just as it was in Boston. Somebody comes to the administration and says, we want to fly a flag. The administration works with them on the date and time, and sometimes there were flags that were not approved by the administration. Here, we are now creating a process for the first time. And again, the process we filed was more of these are a place of public accommodation, and not a place of government speech. What changes and what necessitates the change is that in order to have discretion over what is flown, we need to make it a place of government speech and not a place of public accommodation.
Understood. In regards to this new application process, cost associated with it, are you envisioning this to be free where any organization or anyone could come without charge? And
There's no charge anticipated for submitting an application to fly the flag. I mean, essentially, the process really is you submit the less than one-page application. It'll be relatively short, and then it comes to City Council for consideration. There are no real costs to recover. There is a little bit of time that obviously the Office of Neighborhood Engagement will spend. If they want to hold an event as part of their flag raising and they want to reserve space, then we're into our normal event process, which would have applications for that.
so just for my clarification, this would then, the approval of anything flown on the property of City Hall would fall to the discretion of City Council?
That's correct.
Any questions from other committee members?
If I may, Counselor,
Please.
would the police flag be considered a government flag?
So the police flag is flown at police station, and that would be one of the flags that is normally flown there. But in other regular, like if you're talking about, one of the flags in support of police or one of the flags in opposition to the police, no. Again, there are three flags. The ordinance lays out what is a commemorative flag, what is a ceremonial flag. Neither of those don't qualify as either. But if it's in support of a cause, it can be deemed a commemorative flag, and that would have to come before council for approval. But the City of Lancaster's Police Bureau flag, its independent flag flown at the police station, this would not stop that flag from being flown.
Do you foresee any issues if they're denied and any type of litigations? And I know this is just.
I see the issues if we don't pass the ordinance. I don't see the issues if we do. So again, because you're declaring, and the ordinance clearly declares, the language is set forth in the ordinance in several places specifically, that the flagpoles are not places of public accommodation, then you are free to determine government speech. The place where you would have issues, and this is where city administration and the solicitor's office would have to weigh in when these requests come in, is now we do have the issues of separation of church and state and other things, but we can look at that as they come in. Without it, we don't have the discretion to do that, and then if we do reject a flag because, and I don't have a specific example, I'm sure all of you can think of one that the majority of you would not want a flag flown for, and if it came in and the administration or city council rejected that without this ordinance, we would be subject now under federal law, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, to be in violation of the Constitution for not allowing that flag to be flown. That's the bigger problem. The problem is not the flying of the flag. The problem is not being able to have discretion to exclude a flag.
Thank you, Barry.
You're very welcome.
Any other questions from committee members?
If I may, Councilor Walsh?
Please.
I think you answered this regarding the different types of flags, but would established holidays or national weeks have priority over other flags that were applied for during the same time period?
Well, yeah, what you would look at here is obviously we're going to try and get a schedule. There's no flag that'll be flown for more than 3 business days. So for the most part, City Council, that's where we talked a little bit about being proactive, is having a kind of a resolution. City administration will certainly work on one at the beginning of every year of our known ceremonial flags or commemorative flags that we want to see flown, that have flown historically in the past or associated with holidays that we're celebrating, and ask you to pass on those so they get on the schedule right away. It's also one of the reasons why we've built into the ordinance 120 days in advance, bringing this so that you have, 1, time to go before council, and 2, time to make sure that we can work through any scheduling issues where there might be other events in or around a similar time. Because again, we can only fly one of these at a time, and that's in part because we have an obligation to fly the U.S. flag, the Commonwealth's flag, and we obviously want to continue to fly ours, and this would be flown on the flagpole with the city flag and the city flag underneath it.
And regarding process, if there were any changes to the process, does that have to be brought forward via ordinance or changes to the ordinance? Or can we, on the staff side, update
So
the
that
process?
we've drafted the ordinance to include the preparation and promulgation of policies and procedures by the mayor to be posted on the website in a manner consistent, obviously, with the intent of the ordinance. But the procedures for submitting an application, I mean, that's generally going to be an administrative matter. We prefer not to bring that back to city council every time we need to make a change to say the flag needs to be, of a certain type of material because something has changed in that manner.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions from council? From the public?
Two questions. First is, we recall that earlier this year, a couple of flags were flown at the visitor center. How would that be covered under this ordinance? And second, could you just talk a little about other cities and how they're reacting to the SCOTUS decision?
So this would cover any flagpoles of the city of Lancaster. So if those are on a city facility such as the city's visitor center, then the same policy would apply. In terms of other cities, I can't tell you how other cities. This decision just was enacted in May of this year. I think we're probably one of the first to move forward, but I can't speak to that. I haven't spent my hours looking at other cities' pending legislation. I view my job as trying to be proactive for the city of Lancaster to prevent problems, not to solve them once they exist. I've recommended this ordinance to city council. I've recommended to the administration. I'm here this evening because I think it's the right thing to do for the city to prevent problems, not to create them.
Any other questions from the public?
My biggest concern would be letting organizations know. We have a tendency of changing policies and not putting out there so that organizations that have flown flags before would know that this policy is changed. I would hope that the administration would reach out. Talking about Juneteenth, we could be Pacific, the wrong flag was flown, so I understand where this ordinance would help prevent that by getting the flag prior to. But I think organizations need to know, that the policy is changing, and we don't do a good job on letting people know in advance. I do like the idea. I think if I understood it, it'd be a year, so maybe that would be an ongoing thing. If it's like even the Spanish holiday or Juneteenth would be a repeated thing, or if that's something they would have to come every year and do, like Juneteenth always happens, and I just would hope that that's something that would automatically get put on the calendar.
So there won't be anything automatically put on the calendar unless council approves it. And again, that's to make sure that it's maintained within the concept of government speech. That being said, the Office of Neighborhood Engagement will be really reaching out to all the entities that in the past had requested flags to be flown to make sure they know of the new policies once they're adopted. They'll also be posted on the city website, and we'll certainly use neighborhood engagement offices and devices such as Engage Lancaster and other manners to make sure that the entities that have asked us to fly flags and want to ask us to fly flags in the future will know the process. It's not about keeping a flag off. It's about making sure that an orderly process is followed in order to get a flag on.
Any other questions from the public?
Councilor Walsh, if I could just to put sort of a fine point on your last point, I want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly and make sure that everyone understands correctly that I appreciate that the Department of Neighborhood Engagement would reach out to those organizations that have requested to fly a flag in the past or that we've done it for them in the past. But the point here is that they will need to still follow this process, and that's on an annual basis. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Any further questions from the public or council? So I'll make a motion to move Administrative Bill 15/2022 to full council on August 9th.
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, councilors.
And last but certainly not least, Administration Bill number 17, 2022, amending the Stormwater Management Ordinance. We could have Director Campbell come once more.
We're going to speak from the main table.
Great.
So thank you very much for us being able to present what we think is going to be some very important clarifications and modifications of the stormwater ordinance. The city, as you may know, the city of Lancaster has been a leader not only in stormwater management for this locale and this region, but nationally. There had been work done 10, 15 years ago establishing green infrastructure as a huge tool in how we manage our stormwater. And much of the work that was developed then came about before the advent of the consent decree that has been imposed upon us. As we have moved forward and been executing work during whether it's through a land use review process or whatever, we've been discovering that there have been some inconsistencies and lack of clarity that need to be addressed. There have been a couple of other instances where regulations nationally have changed, and the fact is that the climate is continuing to change, and we need to have our stormwater ordinance be aligned best with the work that we're trying to do. I have with me to help make this presentation Andy Potts from Jacobs Engineering, who is our key stormwater management consultant, and I have with me also Angie Brackbill, who is our stormwater water engineer for the Sustainability and Environment Division for the Department of Public Works. One thing I think and hope that you will note as we go through this presentation, and it's a relatively brief presentation, but I think it's very, very important to go through it in the detail that we are, is that the city of Lancaster is a very interesting, unique environmental location. The stormwater and the geology of the place is a challenge in the best of circumstances. And part of our stormwater ordinance is to ensure that we're able to manage that stormwater best as we can. With the advent of the consent decree, we as the city are and will be financially responsible for managing the water that goes into the Conestoga River. The opportunity that we have is for the developers, as they come on board and impose new needs and requirements in order to fulfill their projects, that we want them to make sure that they're taking care of the water that comes to their property. A statement that you will constantly hear me say is every drop of water that the developer does not manage is a drop of water that the citizens of the city of Lancaster will have to pay to manage via the consent decree in one form or another. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Potts to start this presentation, and I'm hoping that you're going to see it as important as I see it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Campbell. If you could, I guess, do I just ask you to advance the slides? Thank you. Perfect. We just wanted to start with a quick overview of the benefits of the city's stormwater requirements in general. A lot of these are benefits that you're already recognizing, and part of these proposed changes are meant to kind of solidify and even enhance these benefits. So I'm not going to read them all, but certainly first and foremost, protecting health, safety, and welfare, reducing flooding, managing accelerated runoff, encouraging groundwater recharge where it's appropriate, protecting our local waterways, capturing pollutants and reducing those combined sewer overflows, meeting the state and federal requirements, and in a lot of cases providing additional benefits. So the pictures on the right there, we're really trying to minimize the upper photo and maximize the lower photo. So if you go to the next slide, please. The intent of these proposed updates to the ordinance are really, as I said, to clarify, update, and strengthen the ordinance, recognizing to make more effective water quality improvement and combined sewer overflow and flood reduction. And it's really recognizing the fact that, as Mr. Campbell mentioned, a lot of changes have happened over the last 7.5 years since the ordinance was last updated. And so it's really it's time to take another look at it. The changes generally fall into 3 categories, and this is a summary because as everyone can see on the red line document, there's actually over 500 changes. So there's quite a few. A lot of them are small, just streamlining language and even some, typo corrections, things like that. But in general, the more substantive fall into 3 categories. So new references and requirements, clarifications and streamlining, and climate change related benefits or updates, and benefits to address those. So if we go to the next slide, we'll kind of dive into each of these categories, if you will, in a little more detail, give you some examples from each. Again, it's not all of them, but it's touching on the more substantive ones, more significant ones. So new references and requirements, providing references to and eliminating any consistencies with some of the newer documents that have been developed and guidance and regulations, helping clarify the applicability of the regs, of the requirements, better alignment between the ordinance and the great guidance manuals for green infrastructure that the city has, and allowing for more progress towards that consent decree, as Mr. Campbell alluded to. Clarifications and streamlining, these are really trying to make it clearer what's required and what's the approval pathway. Adding some flexibility, though, in there, recognizing that the city is challenging in a lot of cases to work in or to manage stormwater on some of the sites. And then the ultimate goal of both of these things is to try and reduce the number of waivers that the department had been seeing over the years. And you can see the stormwater permit section of the city's website there. So again, trying to make that more clear, that approval pathway. And finally, the climate change related updates. We're looking at both updating rainfall to current conditions and then also looking at some future projections to make water quality protection more effective and also address flooding, ultimately to protect the health, safety, and welfare and improve resilience. If you can advance to the next slide, please. So diving into each of those categories in a little more detail, here are some of the new references that we've already mentioned, the 2017 consent decree, the 2019 green infrastructure manuals, the 2019 update to the city's green infrastructure plan, called Green It. You can see the cover there. And then also some of the other regulations that are coming down onto the city, like the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, who periodically updates their model ordinance and requires that cities make their ordinances at least as rigorous or as their ordinance. And so they have a new one out. It's a little confusing because it came out in 2018, but they titled it the 2022 model ordinance because it has to be, municipalities have to follow it by 2022. So we're coming up on that deadline. So a couple of examples were just specific language changes to show you how we've made some of these references. So in the volume control section, section 203 of the stormwater ordinance, just a simple reference to the city green infrastructure design manual there. And then one of the new DEP requirements from the state is to have a section or prohibition on pet waste going into the stormwater system. And so you can see at the start of that section there that no one can dispose of that everyone should dispose properly of their pet waste, assuming it's not their own property.
May I interrupt for just a second? One interesting comment that we're addressing, for instance, is that the reference to the design guide manual, which is a strong document, was not linked to the ordinance. And so we had guidance that was very good guidance, but it was not necessarily required by the ordinance. This ordinance change allows for that connection.
Right, and it wasn't an omission at the time, it's new guidance. The ordinance was 2015, the manual is 2019, so now we're finally getting to link those up. Good clarification, thank you. So moving on to that kind of next category of changes, clarifications and streamlining, kind of a long list here. Again, I won't read all of them. I'd be glad to dive into any more details on any one of them, but we're adding some new definitions where needed to to explain the changes and any new language that's added. We'll have a pretty simple but powerful clarification to the volume control section, which we'll go through in detail in the next slide. We're adding some exemptions and clarifying that some of these minor activities are completely exempt. So again, kind of a easing of that process and a clarification there. And also that right-of-way impervious is exempt from a developer having to manage. So that's a big clarification there. Additional flexibility for applicants. So we're making it more rigorous in some places, but we're also adding some of that flexibility as well not to compensate, but just as a benefit of streamlining. Off-site discharge limits were clarified, and that also gives the city more flexibility to address areas where you already have capacity issues in your system. And then clarifying the submission requirements and streamlining those, especially in the day and age and with digital submissions and things like that. So reducing paper copies and things like that, which is also a benefit. A couple of examples specifically. One, this gets a little confusing and a little into the weeds here, but it's important in that there was some confusion with the development community in this fairly, right up front in this volume control section of the ordinance. And the intent had been to essentially divide the volume control requirement basically into two buckets. One is manage an inch of runoff, because that's really good for water quality. That captures most of our smaller storms. That gets most of your pollution. And then also control the volume of runoff for storms up to the 2-year storm, which is about 3 inches. So a much larger event, but you don't have to necessarily take care of that full volume, but just not increase it from your development project. And that's more for stream bank protection and things like that, for those big floods, some flood protection, things like that. So those were always meant to both be part of the ordinance, but it was getting misinterpreted as an either or. So now we just simply separate the two sentences. So don't increase the volume for up to the 2-year storm, period, and manage the first inch of runoff. So very simple change, but we think that will help clarify things with the development community. And at the same time, we've added a little bit of flexibility, as I mentioned, on the for some of those challenging sites. So some of those smaller impervious areas, maybe a driveway even, maybe some sidewalk that's part of a development that's hard to manage, hard to just capture that runoff. They have some flexibility in that could either be compensated for by managing a different portion of the site or potentially exempted if certain requirements are met. So that's a nice bit of added flexibility for developers. And on that note of flexibility and clarifications, Public Works, I think, has been doing a great job. They've had many discussions with the engineering community over the last 18 months or so concerning recent and current projects, helping to clarify some of these things even ahead of time, and really emphasizing the importance of thinking about stormwater before, all too often a developer would, site their building, site everything, and then say where we're going to put our stormwater. And that makes it extremely difficult to meet the intent of the ordinance. But Public Works has been saying, if you start at the beginning and think a little more holistically about the site, then you can really start to meet this ordinance without too much burden.
Right. I want to emphasize very strongly that if you design a building first and then try to manage the stormwater around that footprint, you have significantly fewer opportunities to make the progress that you really want. So we really are pushing for a concept which is called integrated design, where at the inception of the project, the discussions are held about the nature of not only the stormwater challenges, but ADA requirements, other kinds of environmental requirements, et cetera, so that before you delimit yourself from a solution, you're talking about all solutions in the context of how do you accomplish managing the stormwater.
Thank you. And And just continuing that dialogue as well. So there's an upcoming forum that's being organized to get more input from the engineering community. And then also, I think, a commitment to continue the dialogue on potential options, even for future improvements to the ordinance that might include things like a fee in lieu of managing on-site, or the or more opportunity to manage off-site within the same watershed, for example. So I think that's great progress.
And if I can add, part of a potential advantage of a fee in lieu of waiver is that in the principle that every drop of water that cannot be managed becomes the expense of the population of the city of Lancaster, that fee would be able to address the costs that may not otherwise be able to be managed. And being able to manage within the same watershed means that the same existing geological infrastructure would be able to manage the volume of water even if there's an artificial property line division. We're not leading with these as the options. These are parts of the discussion that will be held with the engineering community, and we're hoping that we will let these items be potential exceptions, but not the rule of how we go forward.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So moving on to that last bucket or last category of changes is climate change related updates. And there's there's really just two of these. One is to update the 2 through the 100-year storm events, those larger events, based on this new tool called the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Tool, or MRISA for short. This was a tool that was developed in coordination with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So it's a government supported tool for the region, and that has updated or projected storm events for our region, and specifically for City of Lancaster. In comparison, the current ordinance references Atlas 14, which was a great resource at the time it was developed, but it was only using data through 2000, So that's already 22 years out of date almost. And then the other piece of that is that water quality portion of the volume control, that 1 inch. We've done an analysis, and you can see the results of that in the graph. And we've seen since 1975 a pretty steady progression of the amount of runoff you need to capture to kind of manage those frequent storm events. And so now we're proposing that 1 inch goes to 1 1/4 inch as that part of the, and then also to look at that every 5 years, because you can see, you might look at it and say maybe it's plateauing at 1 1/4 inch, but it's certainly there's a potential of that continuing to increase, or potentially decrease, I guess, as well. But so to keep that evaluation updated every 5 years.
One of the things that I think is important about having this kind of metric that is calibrated to climate change itself is that if we were to stay static with the Atlas 14, as we continue to do successful stormwater management development, we would be continuing to fall behind. And we would not be addressing not only the cleanliness of the Conestoga River, but we would be shooting ourselves in the foot in our compliance with the consent decree.
And there is precedent in the state for doing this. The city of Pittsburgh earlier this year did adopt a new stormwater ordinance that uses projections, actually going out all the way to 2100. I didn't get into the detail, but we're proposing just using the nearest time horizon projection, which the tool categorizes as 2020 to 2070. So we're actually already within that period. It's probably reasonable to think of it as really towards the midpoint of that period, which would be 2045. But as I said, Pittsburgh is using projections all the way out to 2100. We didn't want to go too conservative in that sense, and certainly the uncertainty as you project further into the future is more and more. So we thought that nearer term horizon was a very reasonable place to land, not being too onerous. The details on that, here's the language, very simple. The 1 inch goes to 1 1/4 inch. The 2 through 100-year storms just reference the new tool, and you can see the actual depths there. Current ordinance in the second column, and the projected precipitation depths in the third column, and it's an 8 to 10% increase depending on which event. And that's all based on global climate modeling that's downscaled for our region. So, a moderate increase, but we think it's important, as Mr. Campbell said, to not fall further behind with outdated rainfall data. There is, of course, probably an immediate reaction that if you go from 1 inch to 1.25 inches, or if you go from, let's say, 3 inches for the 2-year storm to 3.26, based on the projections of the Marissa tool, that's going to be a big increase in cost. And what we've typically found that if people do take an integrated design process, that the cost increase can be fairly negligible if you do it in a careful manner. And I did find this today, this data from Philadelphia Water Department. After they had done about 225 systems, they studied the cost and were kind of looking at cost trends and all that. And they actually concluded right there, that's a quote, "Total storage volume does not have much of an impact on cost. Median unit cost for all 3 categories," which in their case, they divided anything that's stored less than 1 inch, and then everything that's stored 1 inch to 1.5 inches, and then anything that's stored more than 1.5 inches. And you can see there's a very slight increase in the median cost. It's probably hard to see on that graph, but they basically concluded that it just wasn't significant, and other factors, site conditions and things like that, were much more important. And we've found that in our own design projects as well, for the most part. And the simple explanation is that a lot of the cost is sunk. If you're going to put in an infiltration trench or porous pavement or something, if you have to make that gravel storage layer slightly deeper, you've already have your equipment out there. You're already excavating. You're already repaving when you're done. So all those costs don't change. You're just excavating a little bit more and putting in a little more gravel. So the good news is, even though 1 to 1.25 inches is a 25% increase, we would not expect a 25% increase in cost, but a much less, if any.
And if I can say, most importantly, I continue to stress the integrated design process, because this allows you to think about these things before they become costly changes to an existing design. It does mean that we may need to do some instruction and even some workshops about how does the current development team, when they arrive to the city of Lancaster, think about integrated design. I come from a background where integrated design was a natural part of what we did. I was part of the earlier phases of LEED out of the U.S. Green Building Council. Integrated design was the way you started a project. You got all the professionals and the subject matter experts in the same room talking about everything from energy conservation to heat transfer to landscaping to water management to ADA accessibility, and to figure out how you're going to commit and how you're going to make those things work. I recognize that that's not necessarily how most people do things. But I think in order for us to be successful and in order for the city of Lancaster to continue to be a leader in the environmental realm, while we are facing the challenges of addressing a relatively severe consent decree, we need to adopt these kinds of principles as an integral and natural part of what we do and how we do it.
And I think that's all we had.
Thank you. To your point about the integrated design piece, that's, I think from what I have seen and heard, a lot of them seem like common sense changes, like referencing documents that have been created, to not have to replicate the conversations of, have you seen this document? One of my questions for that is the ordinance nimble enough that if you would have a reference document cited change, you wouldn't need to come back to us to make that change, correct? Like, for example, if the design manual were to change, I guess this is more of an administrative question, that wouldn't require our approval. You could just make that change in the...
I believe that the way we've gone through this, and we've gone through it in detail with our consultants, with our own city engineer, and with the city solicitor, I believe it is set up so that we will not have to make those kinds of changes. There are some things we will need to be aware of. as we approach that 5-year review period, for instance, we'll have to make sure that it's clear what applications apply before the 5-year threshold change and which ones apply after. And if there's a project that's in progress, at what point do you commit that it's in version X versus version Y? And I think those are some of the things that are going to be part of the conversation with the engineering community over the next couple of weeks, so that we'll have greater clarity about that. There are some basic standards that can apply anyway. We could say that the date of your application is the date that conforms, et cetera. There are very simple ways of being able to do that.
That's helpful, because I was wondering, if this is to pass, when does it begin? And what does it mean for projects in existence that maybe have gone through some of these approvals? What does that mean for the future of those projects?
Certainly, and I'm going to jump in, but if Angie would like to jump in after me, I will allow that as well. Many of the developers and engineers that we've been working with that have been submitting projects, some of which have gone before you already, we have done two things. One, we've asked them to ask for fewer waivers. Many of them came to us with pages and pages of requested waivers from the existing ordinance. And we said, wait a second, the purpose and the intent of this ordinance is to be able to better manage the stormwater. So within the existing regulations, to what extent can you avoid the near occasion of asking for those kinds of waivers? Let's sharpen our pencils and do the due diligence that gets a better performing building in the first place. All of them were able to sharpen their pencils and give us better performance on those existing regulations. We then, secondly, asked them to think about what the larger intent is. And we recognized that our hands were tied because the regulation had not yet been changed. So the best we could do is ask for good faith efforts to how well might they be able to accommodate or address the changes that we are anticipating. And it was basically priming the pump in the engineering industry that this is what the new expectation in the city of Lancaster is likely to be. We got a lot of good response, but we got a lot of interesting challenges as well. This is what helped us sharpen our pencils about what kinds of things can be required and what things perhaps are suggestions or things that we cannot require because they're just too onerous. And we're hoping, again, over the course of the next couple of weeks, we'll learn more about that as we reach out to the engineering community some more. But I'm really, as you know, an optimist, but I'm also quite satisfied that this not only fulfills the intent of much of the legacy documents and work that was done over the course of the last 15 years, but also makes the process easier and more streamlined, and in some cases, easier for them to accomplish our intended goals than the current somewhat unclear regulations had done.
Thank you. I think that's my only question for now. And I appreciate the thoroughness of the presentation, so thank you for that. Any other questions from members of the committee?
Thank you, Councillor. I was wondering if those changes would affect or impact the city residents' water bills.
In principle, it will not. The goal is for us to fulfill the regulations as they are currently set so that we have greater predictability. At this moment, if we continue to grant waivers or if we don't require people to fulfill the goals of the regulations, then we find that, and I know I'm speaking more cautiously, but we find that the amount of stormwater that has to be managed will increase, and the amount that will then become the responsibility of the ratepayers will also increase. So this is a way of trying to have greater predictability in the design process and in the new infrastructure that's being built. And when I say new infrastructure, I'm talking about the built infrastructure of buildings and the entities that are imposing new loads on stormwater management, so that there's greater predictability and we can establish the metrics for a baseline of green infrastructure management, et cetera. But the simple answer is, and it's never a simple answer, the simple answer is that it would not and should not affect the rates. In fact, if anything, it will give us a greater opportunity to improve and reduce adverse impacts to the rates. But there's not going to be, by us doing this, suddenly the rates change. The big impact will be on the developers.
So if I understand, it will increase in the future. It will impact their bills in the future.
The bills are going to be impacted in the future in either case. This reduces the extent to which those bills get impacted in the future because it tightens up how we manage how much of the water in question. If we do not, if we allow for these loose ends and allow for the interpretations that we've accepted in the past, we are shooting ourselves and the citizens of Lancaster in the foot because we're not requiring all of the water that the regulations suggest be managed. This gets us in a much better position to predict and measure the water that's being managed. So I know it's not quite the direct answer that you're looking for because it's not a causal relationship, but it is a supported one. It's almost like how do you calibrate and how do you measure performance in any field of endeavor, whether it's sports or baking or engineering, et cetera. How do we enforce and create the opportunity to best manage what we know is running is stormwater, the stormwater that hits the property, the site in question. I don't know if I'm just obfuscating the situation or not. If I'm
Well, I think the simple answer is the hope is it would reduce rates in the long term because the city would have less water to manage, and I think that's what you're saying. The rates may go up for other reasons, but not because of these changes. If anything, these would cause the rates to increase less or decrease over time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor.
Any other questions from the committee? Council? The public? Please.
Always two questions, it seems. But let me ask them one at a time. So first question, I've seen particularly in the suburbs projects where you see, I don't know, just larger and larger swales as a stormwater, piece of stormwater infrastructure. And I've seen some of those in the city as well. After this is implemented, do you expect to see a change in how stormwater is addressed that would, affect building density, the amount of land that's used, that sort of thing?
My hope is that by implementing an integrated design process, we are going to see more opportunities and more examples of good green infrastructure use and development, and being able to utilize open spaces in ways that can be co-located with recreation, with passive cooling, with energy conservation and things like that. The mindset that we often bring to these buildings is, I've got a site that's 60 by 60. I'm allowed to build 100% of the site area, so I want my building to be 60 by 60, and therefore I have no opportunities to manage stormwater except in the roof. The same building, same floor area, same square footage can be accommodated on a smaller footprint, provide a courtyard, provide access for play, access for recreation, access for air, for views, for other kinds of activities, and for more energy efficient ways of managing the building, as well as incorporating not only pervious paving in those plazas, but green infrastructure and green roofs, and possibly retention tanks that would allow for more flexibility of work or a living experience, the experience of the space rather than the building coming all the way up. The city of Lancaster is not unique, but it has some very interesting characteristics, very tight properties, tight sites, small alleys, etc. And we can look at these as opportunities for better development, for those little niches of opportunity to understand our history, to understand the physicality, and to be able to understand and experience the environment. So my hope is, and I've seen it, if necessity is the mother of invention, I've seen a lot more creative solutions when people are required to think about the alternative ways of meeting those guidelines.
The only thing I'd add is that the ordinance is not prescriptive in how to meet the requirements. So you can use a porous pavement, you can use a swale, you can use a green roof, you can use a cistern. So there's lots of options to meet the requirements as well.
Yeah, with non-structural BMPs too, such as trees and things like that as well, so.
And this actually probably builds on Director Campbell's answer to that question, which is, again, this is something developers have to work through. Stormwater infrastructure costs some money. Have any developers indicated that this is becoming enough of a disincentive to make them, have second thoughts about developing in the city?
There have been rumblings, and this is one of the reasons why we are taking the approach that we are, which is not only recognizing some of the benefits, but recognizing that the process needs to change by having an integrated design process. In speaking with the engineers, even in the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks, 2 of those weeks I was away on vacation, mind you, the engineers are saying these things are doable if we can think about these issues early in the design process, not after the building's been designed and then we're invited to solve for stormwater. But if stormwater can be addressed in those early phases of the design, yes, it's doable at very little additional cost, if not any additional cost. So the challenge that I have before me, that we as DPW have, and the consultants and my engineer have, are how do we work with them so that it's as easy and less restrictive as possible. This is why there are 2 or 3 instances where we're providing greater flexibility, where we're reducing or eliminating some of the requirements for fence posts and tombstones and things like that, so that you don't have to go through this extraordinary effort. But I do understand that developers will want to claim that there's a huge additional cost. That's why we have that slide in there. And last but not least, I'm borrowing from Frederick Douglass. No good thing is gained without struggle. In order for us to hit and maintain the standards that we're trying to meet, we have to ask for it. No, we have to demand that our city is going to perform at a particular level of environmental solicitation. And what I take very, very seriously is that if I allow certain stormwater to not be managed, I'm forcing the rest of the population to pay for that. And I'm not going to do that. So I believe that we can make it very appealing to developers, that what's exciting about being a developer in Lancaster is that you will always be doing exemplary work that everyone will be looking up to. That if Lancaster is a place that people aspire to be, they'll aspire to work here, they'll aspire to put their engineering mark on it, and they'll aspire to put their development mark on it. They want to be here.
Thank you. Any other questions from the public?
Darlene Bird. A couple questions. First thing, if you could explain to me between sewer runoff and stormwater runoff, as far as the overflow and what the city can handle, since we just talked about passing an ordinance to allow the old RCA to connect to runoff water, sewer water, and now we're coming up with this. I just need that explanation because I don't get it.
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to defer to the experts, because I'm not an expert. But the sewer basically is our internal sewage, the wastewater that is generated in the use of our buildings. The stormwater that we're trying to manage is the water that falls on our sites and has to get managed, the runoff and the toxins and the oils that it drags into the river. Our city is built on approximately 3/4 of it or 2/3 of it is a combined sewer system where we've got the sewers combined with the stormwater. And so we still need to be able to manage it in order to reduce the amount of combined sewer and stormwater that we have to pay to manage through our wastewater treatment plant. Green infrastructure, which includes the swales and the forebays and the trees, et cetera, allows for managing as much of that stormwater, the water that falls on the site, without going into the sewer or the combined sewer system as possible, and therefore reduces the amount of water, combined water, that we have to manage through that wastewater treatment plant system.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, we're allowing the old RCA or borough building, and I was thinking that most of the city was combined sewer and stormwater runoff, and we're saying we need to manage our stormwater, but we're considering letting them tap in to give us more sewer or stormwater that, we're saying we don't have the capability of controlling right now. That's why we're changing this ordinance.
So if I can make a bit of a distinction, the wastewater treatment plant has a capacity that we have not yet met.
Okay.
It does not mean that we should not manage the stormwater and the combined water better. And if we can avoid water going into that wastewater treatment plant, we avoid the costs of treating the water before it goes. The capacity that we're talking about of 20 to 25 residential units that this particular site would be bringing into the site is really de minimis. It's not radically different than adding a 4-story or an 8-story apartment building, which our wastewater capacity, we have the capacity for. However, a huge amount of the water that we have to manage is related to the stormwater and the combined. So to the extent that we can avoid water coming in and thereby reduce the amount of water that goes to the wastewater treatment plant, the better. Yes, for new developments where you're putting in new units on vacant land or where we're reconnecting, frankly, this particular facility to the wastewater system, it is increasing, but we have the capacity to handle it. I know to you it may sound like it's shaving the difference, but the ordinance that we're talking about here will be dealing with hundreds of times more water than, if not thousands of times more water than the 20 units worth of water that particular facility will bring.
And the other thing about this, the sanitary waste or the sewage, is the plant has capacity for that during dry weather. It's really the wet weather influx of all the stormwater that overwhelms the system. So that's what this ordinance does, whereas that additional sewage flow is a very minor impact because there's the capacity during most conditions.
Okay. And, as the city is trying to build housing and affordable housing, and, would like, again, to consider that cost, because I can understand where engineering is going to say to make these houses affordable. Now we're throwing in this stormwater management part, which, you said you're hearing a little back and, grumbling about that. How will that work out for developers coming in to give us these affordable housing? Where there be some leeway within the changes in this ordinance to address that?
So 2 things I want to say. One is that, for better or for worse, to be building affordable housing means that you're trying to meet a higher standard than most conventional private housing has to meet. So one of the case studies in question, a site in Lancaster, actually came forward with a fully 100% affordable housing program where they are managing the water better than many of the other private developers. And they were doing it as just second nature. because they had to meet higher standards in the quality of the building in the first place, they found themselves meeting higher standards. Now, we haven't given the final approval yet. There's still some pencil sharpening there, but for them, it was second nature. It was not an impediment. It was just how you do good work. It's often the cases where if you start thinking that it's going to be an impediment, it is an impediment. If you start thinking it's a tool so that the better housing goes to the people who deserve a situation that it has less water to manage, less cost of operation, then it's just the natural way of doing good work. My entire career, up until coming to Lancaster, has been related to doing affordable housing. And I'm very proud of the developers and engineers that are coming forward to try to do affordable housing. And for them, this is second nature, because they're used to dealing with major impediments in their designs anyway.
Okay. And my other question was, you said some of the changes were minor and some were rigorous. What are some more of the rigorous? Because you didn't mention any of those when you were explaining. What might, just an example of what you're talking about there?
I think we probably, hopefully, did cover all the rigorous ones, and the two biggest examples are going from having to capture 1 inch for the water quality storm to 1.25, so that's 25% increase, and then the other storm events increasing 8 to 10%.
And so this ordinance is basically going to be changed for new development.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's correct. It is not retroactive. So any project that is currently underway is not required to meet these new standards. And after the regulation is approved, which I hope it will be with the September, either first or second council meeting, then any new, we would establish a date, and based on the engineering community, it may be directly after the approval, or it might be the beginning of next year, that we would establish that all new development must fulfill the stormwater requirements of the new regulation.
And so, and just for clarity, because I think Councilman Lashard asked this question as far as the residents, we now pay a stormwater fee as a resident, and we're saying that is not going to be affected or increased.
Not because of this. This is the way to reduce the impact of any changes to the stormwater fee. The stormwater fee, because we are still going to be subject to the consent decree, we're still going to be subject to other environmental regulations, and we're still on an upward spiral of being able to better manage the stormwater in the city of Lancaster in order to keep the river as clean as possible, and hopefully to leverage our influence upstream so that the water quality improves. Over time, there will be changes and most likely increases to the stormwater rate. That would be the case whether we made these changes to the regulation or not. This reduces or extends further out the possibility of those increases.
Thank you. Any other questions from the public?
Keith Holland. I'm one of those guys who are proactive, thinking ahead of what we're doing here. Have we thought about dredging our streams and rivers? Because that's part of what stormwater is going to be, that runoff that takes place. And the drains, I guess every street seems like they have one of those, I guess a jungle that's supposed to catch the water. But it doesn't seem to be that they are cleaned or removal of all the old weeds that's there, because I know the flowers that they put in were supposed to absorb the water and give us back clean water going out. But that's not the case.
So I have 3 quick comments. I'm going to try to be very, very brief because obviously I'm very, very wordy. There have been a number of studies by Franklin Marshall that indicate not only that the green infrastructure is very effective when it is installed, but it is very effective and almost as effective as it was designed, even if it's not maintained well. Is that an excuse for not maintaining it well? No. The reason some of our infrastructure is not maintained as well as it could be has more to do with staffing, or in the last 2 years related to COVID, we are reframing how we develop our teams for management and maintenance so that we'll have much greater predictability. We are also putting in place an Adopt It program, Adopt the Green Infrastructure Program, Adopt the Storm Grade Program, so that when there are storm events, we have millions or many, many people who can be involved in trying to make sure that those grates are clear. We've got 3,200 storm grates in the city of Lancaster, and we have maybe 8 people to try to keep those clear as time keeps on going. So to the extent that an adopted block program can be available to periodically just make sure that that's clear, it's very, very important. Last but certainly not least, on a whole parallel effort, which is the consent decree steering committee, we're looking at a wide variety of options for how we can address not only the cleanliness of the Conestoga, how we address the perimeter, the river's edge of the Conestoga, and make sure that trash and debris does not get into the river. But what are the variety of ways of looking at it? Dredging, although it's one of the things that may be on that list, is a highly disruptive element that creates significantly more problems than it creates. But it's one of the things that's on the table for not consideration, but to be able to say, is it effective to think about these strategies? We actually have developed an optimization table that's looking at in the neighborhood of, I would say, 600 or 800 different varieties of solutions, which will be part of the optimization process that we're going through over the course of the next 6 to 8 months to develop what are the most and best and cost-effective ways of cleaning the stormwater that gets into the Conestoga. The city of Lancaster has a population, approximately 25% of which is below the poverty level. So we are severely conscious of being cost-effective, not just effective and not just costly, but how can we cost-effectively make the most progress and the most water quality changes. So there are steering committee meetings that go on every few months. Many of them are made public. Much of the information is also available on the Engage Lancaster website, so that the findings as we're developing them are made available to the public as well. And I do invite you and anyone to be able to look at those kinds of things and be free to make kinds of suggestions. No suggestion is off the table, but we are in a rigorous process of trying to address the consent decree, and it is to make the Conestoga as clean as possible.
Thank you. Any other questions from, I'm sorry, did I cut you off? No?
No.
Okay. Any other questions from the public? All right, with that, I will make a motion to move Administrative Bill number 17, 2022 to full council on August 9th.
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
And that concludes the Public Works Committee agenda for this evening.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Councilor Walsh. We now move to our Public Safety Committee. Councilor Diaz.
Thank you. Currently, we have Administration Resolution 65, 2022, authorizing an application for buyer justice grant funding. The city and the county believe it would be in the best interest for both parties to allocate 100% of the JAG funds to Lancaster Bureau of Police. They utilize for purchase of bike patrol equipment, computer equipment, and upgrade of RAMS software. And the city and the county desire to submit the funding application to the United States Department of Justice for fiscal 2022. And that amount would be $49,036. Do we have any questions then from the committee? Any questions from full council? Any questions from the public? And I believe you got lucky over there. So I'll go ahead and motion this to be moved to full council on August the 9th.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
And the next thing is a council resolution of 68-2022 recognizing International Peace Day. I believe Mr. Wolf requested to have the city of Lancaster recognize International Day of Peace of September 21st, 2022. This is a Congress to be honored a Spirit Day, dramatically cutting military spending and reallocating taxpayer funds to take from the United States citizens and apply it toward domestic, human, and environmental needs like low-income housing, food insecurity, fund education and preschool through college to convert the United States a clean energy as well. If Mr. Wolf is here and if he'd like to come up and address City Council.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for considering this resolution. Our organization, Peace Action Network, put this forth in hopes that you would look upon it favorably. We would like to see the International Day of Peace at some point be celebrated as much as the 4th of July. We hope to work with other organizations and with the city to have educational seminars, speeches, film series, everything we can to enlighten the community about not just peace, but the successes of nonviolent resistance in resolving international disputes. Because there's a lot of wonderful research out there about just how successful nonviolent resistance is. And rather than always resorting to military conflicts, we would like to choose to promote that, educate the community on that, get the word out there. So this is a wonderful day to celebrate, to try to get that word out there. I would point out that just today, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, stated that we are closer now to nuclear war than we have ever been. So the stakes are very high, and it's very important that we get the public made aware of this and let them know that they can act on it. So thank you very much for considering this.
Is there any questions from the committee? Any questions from full council? Any questions for the public? And then I'd like to go ahead and move this to August the 9th to full council.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And that concludes the Public Safety Committee, President, Vice President.
Thank you, Councilor Diaz. That takes us to our Economic Development Committee. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I don't have an update today, but just a friendly reminder that the request for proposals for the city's affordable housing solutions is still being accepted via penbid.net through 11 a.m. on August 22nd. Concludes my update.
Thank you very much. Oh, your battery is low. And thank you for that, Councilor Arroyo. That takes us to the Committee of the Whole this evening, and we have one item. And Mr. Henberger, you are still here, so I'm assuming that you will be speaking to this particular item?
Yes, the city clerk.
I can, but you will be much more eloquent on this than I would be.
Asked me to stay since this was supposed to be Council President's presentment this evening. So again, good evening. I'll try to keep this brief. This is a request for a resolution to have the city join in the brief as what's called an amicus curiae in a matter pending before the Supreme Court in the case generally referred to as the 303 Creative LLC case. This is a case arising out of the state of Colorado and is currently pending in the Supreme Court, and it deals, not coincidentally, with public accommodations, which we talked about a little bit earlier this evening. 303 Creative LLC is a graphic and web design company who have brought a First Amendment challenge to the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, a state non-discrimination law that requires public accommodations to serve members of the public without regard to sexual orientation and other protected characteristics. 303 Creative specializes in websites for weddings. So people that are having a wedding would come to 303 Creative and say, we want you to do a website for us for our upcoming nuptials, affairs, and everything else. They did not want to perform those services for people engaging in an LGBTQ wedding. So they got prosecuted under the Colorado state anti-discrimination law, since in Colorado, under that law, if you are providing a public service, you have to do so in a non-discriminatory manner. That case is being fronted by the San Francisco Attorney's Office, is who's preparing the amicus briefs on behalf of local governments and cities around the country. The brief will explain, the purpose of the brief is to explain that local governments have a critically important interest in the enforcement of non-discrimination laws. The Supreme Court's ruling on what this means with respect to public accommodation obviously has impact on those laws. So the resolution before you tonight is to authorize the City of Lancaster to join as an amicus curiae. In other words, their name would be on the brief as an entity supporting the state of Colorado's position in this case. The mayor will also be signing that amicus curiae as a mayor, not on behalf of the city, but as a mayor. So that's the resolution before you this evening, and that's the request.
Thank you very much. And just for the record, there's no cost or liability to us to sign on to this brief. Is that correct?
There is no liability and no cost. The San Francisco Attorney's Office, through the funding of a series of entities, is preparing all of the legal briefs and proceedings. Our only cost is in adopting the resolution.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments or questions from members of council?
Yes, Vice.
Councilor Diaz.
I wanted to find out, this is just related to the website, is that correct? It's not an actual, anything other than that? In other words, is that also pertaining to someone going into someone's store and saying, or some event?
Well, that's the implications the case could have. So Colorado's anti-discrimination law provides that if you offer a business to one, you must offer it to all on a non-discriminatory basis. The Supreme Court's going to weigh in now under this case on whether that anti-discrimination law under the theory of public accommodation is something that's appropriate and applicable under the United States Constitution. So does a state extending public accommodations to any businesses that provide public services, is that constitutionally required? So in this particular case, there were arguments that they didn't want to do this because it was against their religion. In other words, making websites for people participating in a gay marriage. There's all sorts of arguments that are going to go back and forth in the case. The reason that we've been sought for amicus curiae is because the decision of the Supreme Court could have very broad implications on what laws we can and can't pass as it relates to discrimination.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from members of the public?
I have a question, but it's not so much about the committee as a whole, but get public comment for the Economic Development Committee.
There wasn't a report. So there's not typically public comment unless there's an item or a report on the agenda, but perhaps with Councilor Arroyo's forbearance, you might be able to speak with him after the committee meeting, only because it's not about this item.
Right. Okay. I thought you got to speak publicly on any of the committees when you came to these meetings.
Not if there's not an item.
Okay, so it has to be an item that's on the agenda before you can speak.
Correct. Yeah.
And if I may, Madam Vice
Yes,
President, and
please.
just for clarification, anything regarding the specific housing RFP questions have to be answered through pen bid. Council members aren't allowed to respond to them directly.
Yeah. So if it's anything generally,
Yes, correct.
you'd be available.
Yeah.
Okay.
Process.
Sure.
I mean, I think we should be able to find out what that process is.
That's also laid out on the thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to deadline, that's when they're going to make a decision.
No, it says within 120 days.
Okay. We'll continue with this item.
Thank you.
Are there any public comments on this item? Mr. Stoldrayer?
Does the city have the draft of the brief in hand? If not, are there any concerns that it would contain something that you wouldn't want the city to sign on to?
I believe we do.
The Solicitor's Office has a draft and has been reviewing it.
Thank you. All right, seeing no further public comments, I will hear a motion to move this resolution to full council on the 9th.
Motion to move to full council on August 9th.
Second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Mr. Harris.
Yes, Madam Vice President. Mr. Arroyo.
Aye.
Ms. Baker.
Aye.
Mr. Cleese.
Aye.
Ms. Craig.
Aye.
Ms. Diaz.
Aye.
Ms. Walsh.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, councilors.
Oh, and thank you, Mr. Hedberger. That would take us to the report of the clerk of council, and just because of the time and the fact that we had the meeting prior to this, I would like to ask if it will be okay if you would be able to submit this in writing to us.
It was submitted in writing.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our meeting this evening. There's nothing further on the agenda. I'll hear a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I heard a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Since you're all there, I had a question that I was trying to get to.
Sure. Yeah, only because our items were done.
I understand, but